They ordered him out without a second glance, tearing into his presence like it was an offense. Not because of what he did, but because he was black, sitting quietly by a pool he was never meant to touch. In a place worshipping wealth and polished images, his skin alone marked him as unwelcome, his silence mistaken for weakness, his dignity tossed aside as casually as a discarded towel. No one cared to ask his name, no one cared to know his story. They just saw what they wanted to see and acted with the full confidence that their judgment was final. But in their arrogance, they overlooked the one truth that would shatter everything they thought they controlled. Stay with us, because this is not just a story about humiliation, it is a story about power hidden behind humility, about justice unfolding where no one expected it. Like this video if you believe respect should never depend on appearance, subscribe for more untold truths, and comment where you are watching from, and which part of this story leaves you speechless. The Clearwater Resort shimmered under the golden afternoon sun, a haven crafted for those who wore wealth like a second skin. Plush loungers lined the sparkling VIP pool, each one occupied by guests who spoke in low, self-assured tones and laughed with practiced ease. It was a place where appearance was everything and assumptions ruled quietly beneath the surface. Bradley Owens, the resort manager, stood at the far end of scanning the crowd with a possessive eye. He knew the names, the backgrounds, even the spending habits of every guest lounging by the pool. That was his job, to keep Clearwater's image pristine, exclusive, untouchable. When he spotted Derek Coleman, his chest tightened. A black man, alone, dressed in a simple white t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers, sat comfortably in one of the premium loungers near the water. Bradley frowned. Derek's relaxed posture, his quiet confidence, did not fit the narrative that Bradley had meticulously cultivated for Clearwater. Without a moment's hesitation, Bradley turned to a nearby attendant and snapped, "Go ask him which room he's staying in." His voice, though low, carried a weight of expectation. The young woman hesitated, uncertainty flickering across her face. As Derek leaned back, closing his eyes against the bright sun, the attendant approached. She cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice tentative. Derek opened his eyes and gave her a polite smile, waiting for her to continue. "I'm sorry, but this area is reserved for VIP guests only," she said, glancing nervously toward Bradley. Derek raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but questioning. "I am a guest," he replied evenly. "Is there a problem?" The attendant faltered, unsure whether to push further. Bradley, growing impatient, stormed over. His footsteps echoed sharply on the tiled floor, slicing through the lazy hum of the afternoon. Conversations at nearby loungers dipped into hushed whispers. I need you to vacate this area immediately," Bradley said, his tone clipped and full of unspoken accusations. Derek stood slowly, his face unreadable. "I have every right to be here," he said, his voice steady but firm. Bradley crossed his arms, a sneer playing at the corners of his mouth. "Clearwater has standards," he said coldly. "We must maintain them." Guests nearby pretended to look away, but their curiosity betrayed them. Some smirked behind their sunglasses, others exchanged quick glances, a few shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. No one spoke up for Derek. As Derek picked up his towel and belongings with quiet dignity, Bradley watched with a sense of triumph. In his mind, he had just defended Clearwater's honor. He had protected its purity. He did not see the injustice. He did not even question it. Derek walked away from the pool area without raising his voice or lowering his head. His back was straight, his pace measured, but there was a storm brewing behind his composed exterior, a storm that would soon engulf everything Bradley held dear. Bradley turned back toward the pool, straightening his tie with a smug little smile. Around him, the guests resumed their conversations, the moment already fading into the background like a brief, unpleasant glitch in an otherwise perfect day. But not everyone was so quick to forget. The attendant who had first approached Derek stood near the bar, twisting her hands nervously. She had seen something in Derek's eyes, something powerful and unsettling. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it and returned to her duties. Meanwhile, Bradley ordered another round of complimentary drinks for the VIPs, a hollow gesture meant to smooth over any lingering discomfort. He basked in their approving nods, convinced he had done the right thing. As Derek left the shimmering edge of the pool, He paused near the main path leading back toward the lobby. His mind was steady, but the sting of humiliation sat heavily on his chest. The sharp buzz of judgmental whispers still echoed faintly behind him. He could have walked away. He could have let the smallness of Bradley's actions slide unnoticed, but something inside him refused to bend. He turned and calmly requested to speak with a higher authority, someone who could actually understand the gravity of what had just transpired. Bradley, who had been watching Derek's every move like a hawk, intercepted him almost immediately. There was a thin smile on Bradley's face, the kind that masked contempt rather than courtesy. "Sir," Bradley said in a clipped tone, "there's no need to escalate this. You are not authorized to be here, and you need to leave the premises immediately." Derek, maintaining his composure, replied, "I am a guest of Clearwater's senior partners. I am..." The words barely left Derek's mouth before Bradley cut him off, his voice laced with disdain. "I don't care who you claim to know," he said sharply. "You don't belong here." Around them, a few resort staff paused mid-task, sensing the rising tension but remaining silent, trapped between fear of Bradley's wrath and the obvious injustice unfolding before them. Derek stood firm. "Let me speak with your superior," he said simply but firmly. Bradley's eyes gleamed with an ugly satisfaction. "I am the authority here," he replied. "There is no one else you need to talk to." Without waiting for another word, Bradley gave a curt wave to the security guards stationed near the lobby entrance. The guards, trained more in compliance than judgment, approached Derek without question. Bradley crossed his arms, watching with satisfaction as they surrounded Derek with an unnecessary display of force. "Escort him off the property," Bradley commanded, his voice loud enough for the few guests nearby. Public humiliation. Derek did not resist. He allowed the guards to direct him toward the side exit, his steps slow and deliberate, his gaze calm and unwavering, locked onto Bradley's for a brief moment. It was not the look of a man defeated, it was the quiet stare of a man who knew that truth had a weight that arrogance could never match. Bradley, feeling triumphant, turned back toward the lobby. A few guests clapped him on the shoulder in passing, murmuring vague words of approval for keeping the standards high. He accepted their compliments with a smug nod, unaware that every step he took deeper into this inevitable death. Meanwhile, Derek was escorted through the manicured gardens that separated the VIP section from the general resort area. The guards remained professional but distant, offering no apologies, no kindness. They were simply following orders after all. Derek walked without a word, the scent of blooming jasmine filling the afternoon. As they reached the gates, Derek stopped. He turned slightly toward the lead guard and said quietly, "Tell Bradley this is not over." His voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was an unmistakable weight behind those words. The guard shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Bradley, back at the pool, reveled in the illusion of victory. He ordered new security protocols for the VIP area, privately instructing his staff to be extra vigilant against any suspicious individuals. A thinly veiled code that everyone understood, but no one dared to challenge openly. Clearwater Resort had prided itself on discretion, elegance, and exclusivity. But in that moment, it revealed a darker truth about what it valued most. Derek, now standing outside the gates, did not leave immediately. He watched the sun glint off the polished windows, watched as the facade of perfection continued, oblivious to the rot spreading just beneath the surface. Inside, Bradley congratulated himself again. He believed he had averted a scene, preserved the sanctity of Clearwater, and reaffirmed his control. In truth, he had only set the first domino tumbling, a chain reaction that would soon spiral far beyond his reach. The guests returned to their cocktails and conversations, the incident already being reduced to a curious anecdote, a small story to be told and twisted in the retelling. No one questioned why a man was removed simply for sitting by a pool. No one questioned why his presence had been so threatening. The resort lights flickered on as evening approached, casting a soft, warm glow over the manicured lawns and marble walkways. Bradley stood on the balcony above the lobby, sipping from a crystal glass, basking in the fading admiration of his peers. In his mind, the matter was closed. Without warning, the guards closed in tighter around Derek. One reached for his arm, another grabbed his shoulder roughly. Derek, surprised but unwilling to escalate, tried to pull back calmly. "There's no need for this," he said, voice low but firm. The guards responded by tightening their grip, yanking him forward toward the parking lot. The sudden aggression caught the attention of several guests nearby. Conversations died mid-sentence. Drinks were left untouched on white cloth tables. Eyes turned, first curious, then alarmed. Derek struggled to maintain his balance as the guards pulled at him. His sinistrations from their rough handling tore at the seam, a jagged sound cutting through the tense afternoon air. Bradley watched from his perch above the lobby entrance, arms folded, mouth set in a thin line of satisfaction. To him, this was simply the necessary demonstration of order being restored. Derek, a man who had dared to challenge the unspoken codes of Clearwater, was being made an example of. The humiliation was deliberate. Derek, dragged across the immaculately maintained pathway, refused to yell, refused to resist. His silence was more powerful than any protest could have been. But the sight of a black man being manhandled in broad daylight, in a place that prided itself on sophistication and decorum, struck a nerve with several guests who could not pretend not to notice. An older couple near the garden terrace exchanged uneasy glances. A young woman with a designer handbag lowered her phone from her ear, her smile fading into a frown. A few muttered comments drifted through the air. "Is that really necessary?" someone said under their breath, but no one moved. No one intervened. The fear of social disruption outweighed the discomfort of witnessing injustice. Meanwhile, inside the resort's administrative office, Bradley was already taking further steps to solidify Derek's erasure. He ordered the front desk manager to cancel Derek's access to all services immediately. "Mark him as a security threat," Bradley said coldly. "Flag his profile. Make sure he can't come back here again." The young manager hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Sir, he was on a guest list linked to the corporate partners," she began. Bradley cut her off. "I don't care, remove him." The system beeped softly as Derek's account was flagged. In an instant, he was transformed from guest to intruder in Clearwater's official records. His room access revoked, his scheduled amenities canceled, his payment records locked. Outside, Derek finally reached the end of the resort driveway. The guards released him roughly, shoving him toward the outer road that led away from the manicured splendor of Clearwater. His torn shirt fluttered slightly in the late afternoon breeze. He adjusted it quietly, ignoring the stares burning into his back. Bradley stood at the top of the lobby steps, surveying the scene with a grim kind of pride. To him, justice had been served, order had been maintained. He saw no reason to question whether that order had ever been just in the first place. The guests slowly returned to their drinks, their conversations, their illusion of untouched elegance. But a subtle unease lingered in the air. A hairline crack in the polished veneer of Clearwater's reputation. Some guests whispered about the incident, about how quickly it had escalated, about the lack of cause for such public humiliation. But as the afternoon faded into evening, those whispers faded too, buried beneath the music, the laughter, and the clinking of crystal glasses. Derek stood for a moment at the edge of the property, turning to take in the full view of Clearwater one last time. There was no anger on his face, only a deep, silent understanding. Some battles were not fought in the moment. Some victories required patience, strategy, and timing. As the black car carrying Derek disappeared down the coastal road, Bradley remained on the steps of the grand lobby, feeling the self-righteousness simmering in his chest. But a kernel of anxiety began to gnaw at him as murmurs among guests refused to die away. Word about the scene at the pool had already started to spread, carried from lounge chairs to dinner tables with the invisible speed of gossip. Bradley decided he needed to reinforce his version of events before the story could twist out of his control. Pulling his phone from his pocket, he dialed a number he had used more than once in the past when resort issues threatened the pristine illusion he was determined to uphold. "Yes, this is Bradley Owens at Clearwater Resort," he said crisply when the dispatcher picked up. "We have an individual, male, black, causing a disturbance on the property. We need immediate assistance to ensure guest safety." He ended the call before the dispatcher could ask too many questions, carefully choosing his words to sound urgent but vague. To him, it was a simple matter of perception management. To Derek, now well away from the resort. It would be the beginning of an even deeper injustice. The local police department responded faster than expected. Within 20 minutes, 2 patrol cars rolled up the winding driveway of Clearwater, lights flashing in the evening gloom. Bradley greeted them with the practiced smile of a man who had dealt with such situations before. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he said smoothly. "We had a situation earlier today. A man, not registered as a guest, was trespassing in our VIP facilities. He became confrontational when asked to leave. He made sure to add weight to his voice on the words, 'not registered' and 'confrontational,' fully aware of the images they would conjure." The officers nodded, one jotting notes without looking up, the other scanning the opulent surroundings as if searching for hidden threats. Derek, of course, was nowhere in sight by this point, but Bradley insisted that they take an official report. "We have footage," he said, "and multiple witnesses. We take guest safety very seriously. We are now progressing. We take guest safety very seriously." The officers assured him they would file an incident report and increase patrols around Clearwater for the next few days. It was everything Bradley wanted, an official record cementing Derek as the villain, without a single question asked about what had truly occurred. Unbeknownst to Bradley, however, 2 of the guests who had witnessed the earlier altercation had begun speaking to each other in hushed tones by the bar. Michael Reynolds, a silver-haired businessman known for his investments in social justice causes, muttered, "It felt wrong. All wrong. That man was not aggressive. He was humiliated." His companion, a woman named Laura, nodded slowly, watching Bradley shake hands with the officers like a conquering hero. "They didn't even listen to his side," she said. "They didn't even ask." Meanwhile, Derek sat quietly in his hotel suite several miles away, processing the day's events with a cold clarity. He had known the risks. He had seen the disdain in Bradley's eyes long before the first words were spoken. He had also seen the fear in the staff's glances, the way silence had become their shield. Derek poured himself a glass of water, staring out at the ocean beyond the balcony. His phone buzzed once, a short message from an associate confirming that everything was proceeding as planned. No need to rush, no need for anger. Timing would be everything. Back at Clearwater, Bradley held a brief meeting with his senior staff, congratulating them on handling the situation swiftly. He made it clear that any further disruptions would not be tolerated. "We have an image to protect," he said, voice tight. "This place thrives on exclusivity. One incident like today can undo years of branding. Remember that." The managers nodded, though a few avoided his gaze. Beneath their professional masks, unease simmered. They had seen the look in Derek's eyes. They had seen a man who was not defeated, but waiting. As night fell, and Clearwater's lights shimmered against the dark sea, Bradley allowed himself to relax. He believed he had won. He believed he had rewritten the story to suit his needs, closing the chapter before it could grow into something dangerous. He did not realize that the real story was only beginning, one he would not be able to control with a few well-placed phone calls and a polished smile. His confidence was unshaken, his authority reinforced in his mind by the swift and public removal of what he considered a threat to Clearwater's exclusive image. Guests milled about in small, carefully curated groups, and the staff went about their duties with the mechanical efficiency that came from a place where image was valued over substance. Jessica Lane, a young receptionist with bright eyes and a quiet manner, approached Bradley hesitantly near the concierge desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the guest records tablet. She had spent part of the evening researching Derek Coleman's name after overhearing fragments of conversation among concerned guests. What she found had disturbed her deeply. Submarine her courage, she stepped close and lowered her voice. "Sir," she said softly, "I think the man from yesterday, he might be someone important. His name showed up linked to the corporation that owns the property next door. Maybe we should check again." Bradley barely glanced at her. He laughed under his breath, a short, contemptuous sound that sliced the air between them. "Jessica, don't be naive," he said with a smirk. "Anyone can claim connections. If he were important, we would have known. He looked like he didn't even belong here." Jessica bit her lip, clearly wanting to say more, but she knew better. In Clearwater's hierarchy, challenging a manager's decision could cost her more than her job. She stepped back, nodding mutely, while Bradley strode away, his mind already focused on the evening's grand event. That night, Clearwater hosted its annual summer gala, a lavish affair designed to impress investors, loyal guests, and influential locals. Strings of fairy lights illuminated the gardens, champagne flowed freely, and the soft notes of a live jazz band floated across the warm evening air. Bradley, dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, moved through the crowd with the ease of a seasoned politician. He stopped to shake hands, to accept congratulations, to tell the story of how he had defended the resort from an unwanted intruder. With a laugh that was just loud enough to be overheard by nearby guests, Bradley recounted the incident at the pool. "You have to maintain standards," he said, swirling his glass lazily. "You can't just let anyone sit in the VIP section and hope for the best. Sometimes you have to act decisively to protect the brand." His listeners nodded appreciatively, some laughing, others murmuring vague endorsements of his actions. None dared question him openly. Bradley fed off their approval, his arrogance swelling with each nod and each clink of a champagne flute. Across the gala, Jessica stood near the refreshments table, feeling the weight of what she knew, pressing against her chest. She watched Bradley boast, watched the easy acceptance from the guests, and felt a deep unease settle into her bones. She thought about the look on Derek's face, the restraint, the quiet dignity. She thought about the name tied to the billion-dollar property next door, and wondered what would happen if Clearwater's precious image turned out to be built on a lie. But like so many others, she said nothing. Silence was the currency of survival here. Bradley continued to work the room, positioning himself perfectly for a future promotion he already envisioned in his mind. In his world, success was a matter of maintaining control, projecting confidence, and crushing dissent before it could bloom. He saw Derek's removal not as a mistake, but as a necessary defense against what he perceived as a threat to the exclusivity that Clearwater promised. As the night wore on, the party grew louder, the guests more relaxed. Bradley made his way to the main stage where the CEO of Clearwater's parent company was scheduled to give a short speech. Bradley positioned himself strategically near the steps, ready to bask in any reflected glory. He had no idea that whispers about the incident had already started seeping into the higher echelons of the company. Small but persistent questions that would soon converge into something far more dangerous than he could anticipate. It did not take long for the name Derek Coleman to circulate quietly among them, sparking uneasy recognition. Michael Reynolds, a well-known investor with substantial influence, overheard Bradley's boasts about removing an unwanted guest and felt a slow burn of anger rising in his chest. Michael had met Derek before at several high-profile industry events and knew him not only as a man of impeccable reputation, but as a strategic and powerful business figure. Michael waited patiently for the right moment. When Bradley once again launched into his embellished story about keeping Clearwater exclusive, Michael stepped forward, glass in hand, voice calm but firm. "You know," he said loud enough for a nearby circle of listeners to hear, "sometimes the way you treat people reveals far more about you than it does about them." Bradley, already flushed with champagne and self-satisfaction, sneered openly. "We have standards to maintain, Michael," he replied with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Not everyone fits in places like this." That man was trouble waiting to happen. Murmurs rippled through the small crowd. A few heads turned away uncomfortably. Others pretended not to hear. Bradley continued, undeterred, his words dripping with the kind of arrogance that only grew when unchecked. Michael took a step closer, lowering his voice but sharpening his tone. "That man," he said slowly, "is one of the principal owners of the billion-dollar estate right next door. He is more valuable to this community than half the people at this party combined." There was a sharp intake of breath from someone nearby. Jessica Lane, who had lingered at the edge of the room all evening, caught the exchange and felt a rush of vindication mixed with dread. Bradley laughed loudly, brushing off Michael's words as if they were some absurd joke. "Oh, please," he said, waving his hand as though dismissing a child's fantasy. "If he had real power, he wouldn't be dressed like a maintenance worker." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Michael stared at Bradley with thinly veiled disgust but said nothing more. He knew better than to argue with a man too arrogant to recognize his own impending ruin. Turning away, Michael muttered under his breath, "You just signed your own obituary," before slipping back into the crowd. The small group around Bradley had heard everything. Some guests exchanged troubled looks. Others began to drift away, suddenly eager to distance themselves from the manager whose mask of polished professionalism had slipped so completely. Bradley, oblivious to the shifting mood, refilled his glass and continued to parade through the gala as if nothing had changed. In his mind, the brief confrontation with Michael was nothing more than an annoying ripple in an otherwise triumphant evening. He convinced himself that his position was secure, that his judgment was infallible, that Clearwater's success would shield him from the consequences of one man's bruised ego. He could not have been more wrong. By the time the gala wound down and the last guests stumbled toward their luxury suites, the seeds of Bradley's undoing had been firmly planted. Whispers about the altercation spread beyond Clearwater's manicured lawns, reaching ears that mattered far more than he realized. Derek, meanwhile, was already moving quietly behind the scenes, assembling the leverage he would need not merely to respond but to reshape the entire narrative. What Bradley had failed to understand was that power, true power, often wears a quiet face and speaks in actions rather than words. The morning after the gala, Clearwater Resort buzzed with a nervous energy. Staff moved with mechanical politeness, managers huddled in whispered conversations, and even the most oblivious guests sensed that something had shifted. Bradley Owens, still clinging to the illusion of control, prepared for another day of ensuring everything at Clearwater ran according to his standards. As he adjusted his cuffs and polished his appearance, Derek Coleman stepped through the grand entrance with the unhurried confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. Dressed sharply in an understated designer suit, he made his way toward the reception without glancing left or right, his mere presence causing ripples through the ornate lobby. Jessica Lane saw him first, her heart leaping into her throat. She quickly averted her eyes, pretending to review guest files, but she felt the weight of what was coming settle heavy on her shoulders. A senior concierge approached Derek, expecting perhaps a complaint or a reservation inquiry. Instead, Derek introduced himself not as a disgruntled guest, but as the principal stakeholder and legal owner of the billion-dollar property that flanked Clearwater's eastern border, a property so intertwined with Clearwater's prestige that any disruption in their relationship could trigger immediate financial disaster. Calmly but firmly, Derek requested a formal meeting with the senior leadership of the resort's management company, demanding that all department heads, including the on-site manager Bradley Owens, attend. His tone left no room for negotiation. Jessica watched the interaction unfold, noting the sudden paleness on the concierge's face, the hurried whispers that followed as the message traveled up the chain of command. Within minutes, the request had become a command. Bradley received the summons just as he was preparing to conduct his morning staff briefing. Confused but too arrogant to sense the true threat, he brushed it off with a chuckle and said, "Probably just another entitled guest looking for perks." His laughter rang hollow, and even his closest assistants found it difficult to muster a response. Reluctantly, he made his way to the executive conference room, a glass-walled chamber reserved for high-profile meetings. Inside, the air was heavy with unease. Department heads sat stiffly around the polished mahogany table, their usual camaraderie replaced by a palpable tension. Bradley entered last, his smile faltering slightly as he noticed how none of his colleagues would meet his eyes. Derek was already seated at the head of the table, a stack of neatly organized folders in front of him. His posture was relaxed but commanding, the kind of authority that came not from titles but from the unshakable certainty of ownership. As Bradley took his seat, Derek began to speak. His voice was steady, precise, and carried the quiet force of someone who had long since mastered the art of wielding real power. "Thank you all for coming," Derek said. "This meeting concerns an incident that took place yesterday at Clearwater Resort. An incident involving your staff, your policies, and a direct affront not only to me personally but to the values this resort claims to represent." Around the table, uncomfortable shifts and furtive glances passed between the executives. Bradley sat rigid, a growing sense of dread gnawing at his composure. Derek continued, laying out the timeline of events with meticulous detail. He spoke of his initial arrival, the unwarranted confrontation at the pool, the humiliation he endured, the subsequent call to local authorities, and the complete mishandling of the situation by the resort's management. He presented documentation proving his association with the investment group that owned the neighboring estate. He cited contracts, partnership agreements, and cross-promotional campaigns between Clearwater and his property, making it painfully clear just how vital he was to the financial ecosystem they depended on. "I have built my career on partnerships founded on mutual respect," Derek said. What happened here was not just a lapse in judgment, it was a systemic failure rooted in assumptions that have no place in a professional environment. Bradley shifted in his seat, feeling the walls closing in. The final blow came when Derek addressed the immediate consequences. He requested a formal written apology, reparations for the damages to his reputation, and a thorough review of Clearwater's internal policies regarding guest treatment and diversity sensitivity. He demanded that a detailed action plan be submitted within the next 72 hours, or face the withdrawal of all cooperative agreements with his company, a move that would strip Clearwater of lucrative access to high-end clientele. Bradley opened his mouth, desperate to salvage his position, but Derek raised a hand, silencing him with a simple gesture. "You will have your opportunity to respond," Derek said coolly. "Tomorrow morning in front of the full corporate board." The next morning, the executive boardroom at Clearwater Resort was unrecognizable. Gone were the casual smiles and relaxed demeanor of senior management. In their place sat rows of tense executives, legal advisors, and public relations officers, all summoned by urgent orders issued overnight. At the head of the long table stood Derek Coleman, composed and deliberate, very embodiment of a storm about to break. Bradley Owens entered last, trying to mask his fear behind a strained mask of professionalism, but his stiff movements and darting eyes betrayed him instantly. The chairman of the resort's parent company cleared his throat, gesturing toward Derek to begin. Without a wasted moment, Derek placed a sleek black laptop on the table and connected it to the overhead projector. With a click, the first video played, showing grainy but undeniable footage of Derek at the Clearwater pool, sitting quietly moments before the confrontation. Bradley's voice, unmistakable and cutting, echoed through the room. "People like him don't belong here," the recording captured him saying to the staffs. Gasps rippled through the audience. Bradley shrank in his seat, sweat beading at his temples. Derek's next file was an audio recording, taken during the gala. Clear as crystal, it captured Bradley's mocking laughter and the belittling comments made about Derek's appearance. "He looked like a maintenance worker." Bradley's voice sneered across the speakers. Murmurs of disgust rose among the board members. Derek moved methodically, each piece of evidence more damning than the last. Emails surfaced, revealing internal communications between Bradley and other managers, discussing keeping the right image and subtly encouraging the profiling of certain guests. Finally, Derek laid down a printed document. Sworn statements from employees and guests who witnessed the mistreatment firsthand, including Jessica Lane and Michael Reynolds. "You have a systemic problem," Derek said, voice calm but sharp. "A culture cultivated under Mr. Owens' leadership that violates not only professional ethics but the very principles Clearwater claims to stand for." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle thickly. In the room, when no one spoke, Derek continued. "However," he said, his tone shifting slightly, "I am not here merely to seek an apology." A hush fell. Every eye locked onto him. Derek straightened his jacket, then delivered the final blow. "I am in the closing stages of negotiations to acquire controlling interest in Clearwater Resort." He let the words sink in fully. Once finalized, any leadership found complicit in discriminatory practices will be immediately terminated, effective the same day the ink dries. There was no need for threats. The statement itself was a promise, clear and irreversible. Executives shifted uncomfortably. Some paled visibly. Bradley could no longer remain silent. His voice, trembling despite his efforts, broke the stillness. "This is outrageous," he said, his hands splayed on the table. "You are destroying a reputation I spent years building." Derek fixed him with a cold stare. "You built your reputation on exclusion," he said, "and now it will collapse under the weight of its own hypocrisy." Derek turned to address the board. "It is not only a legal necessity but a moral obligation to ensure that Clearwater reflects inclusivity, dignity, and respect for every guest and employee." Several board members nodded, their faces grim but resigned. They saw the future unfolding before them, and it no longer included Bradley Owens. The meeting concluded with the board unanimously agreeing to Derek's terms, pending the finalization of the acquisition. Derek left the conference room first, his departure as composed as his entrance. Bradley remained seated, staring blankly at the polished table surface, the reality sinking in like ice water in his veins. Around him, Whispers began anew, but this time they carried none of the respect he once commanded. They spoke of betrayal, of lost profits, of a legacy tainted beyond repair. The empire Bradley had ruled through fear, manipulation, and arrogance had crumbled in less than a day. He was stripped of all managerial authority, escorted from the premises by private security, hired by the parent company to avoid further scandal. There was no farewell party, no handshake of thanks, no golden parachute. His severance package, once projected to be generous, was frozen pending a legal review of his misconduct. Bradley, once the face of Clearwater's exclusivity, was now a liability no one wanted to touch. He left the resort grounds under a sky heavy with thick gray clouds, a fitting contrast to the blinding sun that had shone over his previous reign. As word of Bradley's downfall spread, the financial damage to Clearwater Resort accelerated. News outlets across the country picked up the story, with headlines like, "Clearwater Resort Manager Fired for Racial Discrimination," and "Disgraced Manager Humiliated Billionaire," investor blaring across television screens and social media feeds. Investigative journalists dug deeper, uncovering other questionable practices under Bradley's leadership, amplifying the scandal far beyond anything the board had feared. Within 72 hours, at least 8 major corporate partners canceled their contracts with Clearwater. Wedding parties, corporate retreats, and long-term stay agreements evaporated overnight. A reporter from a major financial news outlet summarized the situation bluntly. Clearwater Resort, once a crown jewel of luxury hospitality, now struggles under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Investors, alarmed by plummeting valuations, began liquidating their stakes. Some attempted public statements of contrition, but the damage was irreversible. In boardrooms across the industry, executives made quiet decisions to sever all informal ties with Bradley Owens. Recruiters who once courted him now blacklisted his name. "He's toxic," one HR director said bluntly in a leaked email. "No brand serious about diversity can even consider him now." Bradley tried to reach out to old contacts, desperately attempting to salvage remnants of his career. Voicemails went unanswered, emails bounced back with cold automated replies. He even showed up uninvited at an industry mixer in Miami, only to be politely but firmly turned away at the door. In a world built on perception, Bradley had become a pariah. He moved out of his luxury condominium and into a modest apartment on the edge of town, his fortune hemorrhaging with every passing week as legal fees and pending lawsuits piled up. Sitting alone at his kitchen table, staring at unpaid bills and foreclosure notices, Bradley replayed the sequence of events over and over in his mind, but the ending never changed. His arrogance had destroyed him. Meanwhile, Clearwater Resort, now under interim leadership appointed by Derek's investment group, scrambled to recover. New training programs were implemented, diversity officers were hired, apologies were issued, some public, some private, but the resort's reputation, once pristine, now bore an indelible stain. Guests who had long valued its exclusivity now questioned the ethics behind its marble floors and crystal chandeliers. "It's not just about luxury anymore," one former client said to a reporter. "It's about integrity." Bookings dropped by 30% within the first month. Analysts predicted it would take years and hundreds of millions of dollars in lost revenue before Clearwater could hope to regain its standing. Derek watched these developments from a measured distance. He had no interest in gloating. True justice, he knew, was not loud. It was thorough. It was enduring. It dismantled not just the individual, but the system that allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked. In his private meetings with the new management team, Derek outlined a vision not based on exclusion and fear, but on genuine excellence and respect. Clearwater, if it survived, would emerge stronger for it. And if it didn't, it would serve as a monument to the consequences of arrogance unchecked by accountability. In the months that followed his disgrace, Bradley Owens disappeared from the world he once dominated. He sold what little remained of his luxury possessions, severed ties with the social circles that once embraced him, and drifted aimlessly through a series of failed job applications and humiliating interviews. His name had become synonymous with scandal, and no amount of charm or polished rhetoric could erase the stain left behind. Desperation, once a foreign concept to him, became his daily companion. Eventually, he found work at a modest seaside inn 2 towns away from Clearwater, a humble establishment owned and operated by a black entrepreneur named Marcus Green. The irony was not lost on Bradley. who accepted a housekeeping position with no privileges, no office, and no special treatment. Marcus, having recognized him immediately, had still chosen to offer him a chance, saying simply, "Everyone deserves a shot at redemption, even when they don't believe they need one." The work was grueling, the pay minimal, but for the first time in years, Bradley found himself doing something honest, something stripped of pretense. He scrubbed floors, made beds, trimmed hedges, and washed dishes alongside colleagues who measured worth by effort and respect, rather than pedigree or appearance. In that stripped-down world, where no title shielded him from scrutiny, Bradley faced himself for the first time, without, at first, resentment gnawed at him, fueled by old pride and humiliation. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, that resentment gave way to understanding. Watching Marcus lead with quiet dignity, treating every guest and employee with unwavering fairness, Bradley began to see leadership not as domination, but as service. The realization burned, then softened, until it became a slow-growing resolve deep within him. One evening, after a particularly long day clearing storm debris from the inn's garden paths, Bradley sat alone in the small, shared, staff lounge, staring at the faded walls and humming refrigerator. A battered notebook lay open in front of him, and after several false starts he began to write. The words did not come easily. Pride fought him at every line, but he forced himself onward, each sentence a small act of penance. In his letter, addressed to Derek Coleman, he made no excuses. He spoke plainly, acknowledging the pain he had caused, the arrogance he had embodied, and the lessons he had been too blind to see until it was too late. "I understand now," he wrote, "that respect is not given to a man because of how he dresses, or how much he spends, or the color of his skin. It is owed to every human being simply because they exist. I failed to honor that truth, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." He finished the letter with a simple request, not for forgiveness, he knew that was not his to demand, but for the chance to someday prove by actions, not words, that he had changed. He mailed the letter the next morning without expecting a reply. In the weeks that followed, Bradley kept his head down, continuing his work with quiet determination. The anger that once fueled him had been replaced by a steady humility, a desire to contribute rather than command. Slowly, trust built among the staff. He shared laughter over shared meals, stayed late to help without being asked, and offered kindness without expectation. One afternoon, Marcus called him into his small, cluttered office. Bradley entered nervously, unsure of what awaited him. Marcus simply handed him a small envelope. Inside was a card with clean, elegant handwriting. "Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step," Derek had written. "Living differently every day is the real journey. Keep walking." Bradley closed the card carefully, feeling the weight and freedom of those words settle into him. No formal reconciliation had been demanded. No sweeping gesture of forgiveness had been offered. Instead, Derek had given him the one thing Bradley had lost and thought he would never regain: a path forward, however narrow and steep. Standing on the worn wooden porch of the inn that evening, Bradley watched the sunset bleed across the horizon, the colors rich and deep. For the first time, in a very long time, he felt a sense of peace. Not because his life was easy or because all was forgiven, but because he understood now what true dignity meant. It was not a matter of status or possessions or appearances. It was rooted in humility, in respect, in the simple but profound act of seeing and honoring the humility in everyone. He breathed deeply, letting the salting air fill his lungs. Tomorrow would bring more hard work, more small steps, but for once he was ready. And if you found this story powerful, do not forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that remind us why respect and dignity matter more than ever. Which part of Derek's journey surprised you the most? Was it the moment he revealed his true identity, or the quiet way he chose to change everything, without raising his voice? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Also, tell me where you are watching from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories can travel.